Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the midweek devotional for the East Allen County Church of Christ. We welcome you with us. If you're a visitor and you haven't been by to see us or visit us here in New Haven, Indiana, please come by and see us. We're glad to have you, and we'd be honored to have you in our worship assembly and have an opportunity to talk with you about the Lord. Tonight, I just want to briefly discuss with you the concept of doing what is right rather than doing what is easy. We live in a world where people assume that doing what is right will automatically always be easy. Now, in one sense for the Christian, doing what the Lord would have us to do is always the best thing to do. Still doesn't mean it's the easiest thing to do. Sometimes doing what is right is the difficult thing. There's another cliche very similar, and it says, always take the hard right as opposed to the easy wrong. And unfortunately, in the world we live in, many people believe that doing whatever is easiest at the moment, whatever suffices us for the present second, is what we should do, and then don't worry about the rest. But sometimes we need to do what is right, and it's going to come at a cost. It might come at a sacrifice. It might be a difficult thing to do. And the best example I can think of course, would be Jesus. Here is one who came down to earth, who came to save our souls with his sacrifice, to teach us, to show us God's love on earth, and to in fact be the image of God on earth. And he left you've got to believe, comfort and ease of heaven to do that. And he comes down to this earth. He is scourged, he is scorned, he is mistreated, not believed. He is subjected to ridicule and all kinds of disbelief. Imagine if one day you woke up in life and somebody said, well, you're not who you say you are. Let's just say your name is John. And I'm not thinking of a John in particular. I'm just using that name because it's very common. But let's just say your name is John. You're an auto mechanic and you have a wife and children. And let's say you wake up one day and your wife and kids sort of recognize you, but when you go to work, they don't know who you are, or anywhere you go in society, nobody really recognizes you. You say you're a mechanic, and they're, oh, what kind of mechanic can you be? You come from the wrong part of town to be a good mechanic. And all these things, and you know what you are, but they don't know what you are. And let's pretend for just a minute that people have told you, or told the community about your coming. This great mechanic is coming, and he's going to be here, and we'll be glad to have him because we all have cars that don't work, and we need someone capable and competent to work on them. And yet you show up, and no one will recognize you for who you really are. In fact, when you tell them who you are, they still don't believe you. I one time had a good friend of mine who was at the time a linebacker for the Detroit Lions, and I love this guy today. I admire him so much. I've sort of lost contact with him, and I'd love, if he sees this video, for him to contact me. But his name is Landon Johnson, and he used to play for Purdue University and held a lot of records at Purdue University. He's a wonderful athlete, but even more than that, and more important than that, he's a wonderful Christian man. And he happened to play for the Lions. Well, he came from another team. I believe it was the Bengals. I believe it was the Bengals. But he came over from the Bengals, let's just say, and he started with the Lions. And there was a big write-up in the sports page in Detroit about him coming, and there were some articles. He's just a great athlete, and the team was glad to have him. I had no idea he was a member of the Church of Christ. And so this young man shows up in our assembly one morning, and he's dressed modestly, but he's not. He's just dressed modestly. He just looked like a regular, everyday person coming through the door, which is what he was anyway. But he was a young man. And sometimes when visitors come to our services, they leave very quickly. We don't always get to meet them, and I hated that. He got out the door and I didn't get to see him. I'm sure he had somewhere to go or something to do. So he comes back again. Same thing happens again. And I told my elders, we have this gentleman visiting. I've been trying to catch him, but he seems to escape before I can get to him. I was almost thinking it was a personal thing. He was trying to dodge me, but it really wasn't true. So the third time he comes, he has this young lady with him. Now, Landon looked very young for his age. Of course, he wasn't that old anyway. He was in his 20s, but this young lady comes with him. And so that Sunday night he comes, he worships with us, and he's leaving. And this is at the Allen Park Church of Christ. And so he's out in the parking lot, and I just about have to run him down to catch him. And the young lady wasn't with him. And old guys always tease young guys about, the girls in their lives and stuff. And I said, I saw that young lady sitting with you today, and I see she's not with you this evening. And he said, well, that's my wife. And I thought, well, okay. First thing that dawned on me is he's older than I thought he was. And and I said, well, he's introduced himself as Landon. And I said, well, Landon, what do you do? And he said, well, I work with the Lions. And this is where I'm thinking, what a nice young man. He works with people who help folks with sight impairment, which I have. And I thought, wow, he works with the Lions. A young man doing that. That's awesome. That's great. And I told him that, and he said, no, the football Lions, the Detroit Lions. And I was like, and then I saw his face. I looked at his face, and I saw it before, but I didn't put it in context. And I was like, oh my goodness, you're Landon Johnson, that Landon Johnson. And he said, yeah. And he and I, we both laughed about it. And I just enjoyed getting to know Landon. And I didn't get to know his wife that well, but I believe she lived back in North or South Carolina, one of the Carolinas, but she would travel up anyway. So Landon and I would visit, and we'd have a good time. But I say all that to say that, it's very difficult to be a person that folks don't recognize. Sometimes it can end humorously, like with Landon and myself. We sort of laugh about that. But what must it have been like for Jesus, who came here to do a very difficult job and was never really recognized for who he was, except by a few. And that was apparently part of the plan. An amazing plan, needless to say, not one that I would have certainly thought of, or I think anybody else would have. God thought of it, and he knew that it was the right thing to do. But going back to our concept, doing the right thing is not always doing the easiest thing. And I want to share a couple of stories with you tonight. These are, I say stories, they're Old Testament events, things that happen. And the first character I want to bring to your attention is Joseph in Genesis 39, verses 1 through 23. And I want to go ahead and read this. It's a little bit lengthy, and so will the next passage, but we're only going to deal with these two tonight. And by the way, I have study sheets available for anyone who would like to study these lessons, perhaps while we're going through them on video, or you can go back, get the lesson and go back. I have study sheets for all of the lessons that we have on video for our Wednesday night devotionals, and you're certainly free to ask for them. Please contact our secretary, Shirley, and she will set you up with all the studies that you would like. And I believe, all the ones if she's missing any. But let's go ahead and take a look at Genesis 39, verses 1 to 23. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had taken him down from there. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer over his house. And all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he didn't listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me," and he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled, she called to the men of her household and said to them, See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left the garment beside me and fled and went outside. So she left the garment beside her until his master came home. And then she spoke to him with these words: The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to me to make sport of me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled. Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, This is what your slave did to me, his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in jail. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whenever he did, the Lord made him to prosper. Isn't it amazing, this story of Joseph? Now, you have to understand the preface to this is that Joseph was 17 and he had a vision. He had a vision that indicated that his brothers would serve him. And his brothers didn't like that vision, and some of them plotted his harm. Others tried to save him, but eventually he wound up being sold to a traveling caravan that was coming through, the Ishmaelites. Now, he gets to a certain point in Egypt, and he is purchased from the Ishmaelites as a slave, which was his reason for being bought to begin with. But now this is what interests me. There are a few things about this story, a couple in particular, that have always stood out to me. The first is the one who purchases Joseph, and that is Potiphar's chief of bodyguards. Now, unlike today, when a person has a job of great position, they may not have always been an administrator. They may not have had the benefit of a relative owning a business and then giving them the business, and they never had to work their way up. In this day and age, unless you were royalty, most people in any trade, and especially in terms of service like this, work their way up through the ranks. So if you were the chief of all bodyguards, if you were the manager of all bodyguards, you worked your way up. You were a serious individual. And of all the people to buy Joseph, the chief of all the bodyguards is his master. And of all the women to try to seduce Joseph, it would be the wife of the chief of all the bodyguards of the royalty in Egypt. I mean, it's just a hard thing to fathom. If there was a fellow in town that you needed to be worried about more than Pharaoh, it was this guy. He knew everybody that was important. He had access to anybody who was important, and I am sure he had authority to deal with anybody he thought was a threat to these people. That was his job. And so he comes into this man's household, into Potiphar's household, and everything he does is blessed. Potiphar trusts him implicitly with everything in the household. He holds back his wife, and that was what Joseph said. I don't guess Potiphar had to tell him that was the case. I'm sure that anyone with that much common sense would know that's the man's wife. You leave her alone. So Joseph, he was a good man. He was a good young man. He was probably somewhere in his 20s. And so he is or maybe he might have been a late teenager when this actually occurred. We're not entirely sure of his age at this point. But he goes in. Potiphar's wife, she, as they say, takes a shine to him. She recognizes him. He's apparently a handsome young man, and she is a woman with morals, let's just say without morals. And so she wants to use him as a slave might be used in a lot of ways back then. He refuses. Now, that took a lot for him to do. He refuses the woman who can end his life. He has a couple of things. One, there's some questions here I'd like to share with you. What was the temptation that Joseph really faced? I'm not sure that the temptation was the wife all that much, at least not her beauty. I don't know what she looked like. She could have been a very beautiful woman. She could have been very homely. I don't know. All I know is that he could have been tempted to simply submit because that would have made his life easier. If I just go along with this, then my life will be easier and everything will be fine. The other thing that he might be tempted to do if he were to do that would be to betray his master. Something that he actually names he will not do. He's not going to betray God. He's not going to betray the one who has trusted him to take care of the household. He said he's not going to do that. And so he runs away from this woman. In fact, so much so that he leaves his clothes behind. And it was probably obvious to a degree, or at least appeared, I should say, to a degree to some people who might have said, well, there he was. He ran out of the house. He was embarrassed, blushing, whatever he was doing. He was trying to get away from her without his clothes on. And she said she screamed. There's nothing in Scripture that says she screamed. She might have yelled at him for not complying, but she wasn't screaming for her safety. She wasn't worried about herself. The only thing she wanted was a young man in her bed, and he refused to go there. Thankful for him. And by the way, in our day and age, that would be called sexual harassment. We think about in modern terms what this would be. Sometimes we don't think about it in terms of women against men, women harassing men, but it does happen. And it probably happens more than is reported either way. But the truth is that in this case, she was harassing Joseph, and he did not submit or succumb. She was powerful. The first thing she did, she was going to tell her husband and lie about the circumstance. I've always surmised, based on what I'm reading here in my time as a counselor, this is not her first rodeo, as they say. This is not the first time she has ever tried to do this. I would say probably that many young men or some have succumbed or submitted to her commands. But the reason I say this is because Potiphar could have drugged Joseph in the front yard and killed him right there. It says he was angry, but Scripture doesn't exactly say about what. I've dealt with a lot of marriage situations where a couple may be angry, and sometimes they don't even know exactly what they're angry about. But in this particular case, I think Potiphar was angry over the circumstance. I think he might have been very angry at his wife, because I have a feeling you don't have inroads to intelligence like being the chief or manager of all the bodyguards and not know a lot of things that go on. And it's entirely possible that Potiphar knew that his wife was doing things like this. And here's Joseph, this young man who has helped his household to prosper, and he can't keep him in the house anymore. He can't leave him in that position anymore because his wife has ruined it. She's going to go around and tell everybody that this young man did something he did not do. And to save face, Potiphar puts him in jail. The jailer immediately, seemingly, puts him in charge over so many things in the jail, doesn't supervise him. And I don't know if he was hoping he would fail so he could put him to death or what the case was. But I would imagine Potiphar said, look, this kid, he's a good kid. He knows what he's doing. If you put him in charge of stuff, things get done. He gets blessed. And you'll get blessed. And I believe that's not what Scripture says. And I always tell people, if I say my opinion, I'm telling you, that's my opinion. But based on what I know about people and how I've read this passage, that's exactly what it looks like. They had no problems killing a slave. That was just not an issue. And I would dare say if Potiphar thought for 1 second that Joseph attempted what he was blamed for, Potiphar would have had no problem at all doing what he had probably done previously with other people with less reason. So all that being said, take it how you will. We have to believe what Scripture tells us. And we see that Joseph was blessed in what he did. And we know that Joseph winds up in the end saving eventually the same brothers in his family who sold him into slavery. What an incredible story of many things, of faith in God and honor of God and trust of God. And what about the fact that God preserved him through all of this? And Joseph never once apparently seems to blame God for anything. Not that God deserves any blame, but some people would be tempted to say, well, God let me go through this, or God put me through this, or, God doesn't put us through horrible things in life. And I know that sometimes we think that's the case. God may allow us to endure something, but He's not the one whose hand is at work forcing us to be tortured or persecuted or whatever the case is. He wasn't doing this for Joseph. In fact, He blessed Joseph to the degree that Joseph was lifted up. Once he got out of Potiphar's house and into jail, he gets out of jail, he's lifted up to the second highest position in the most powerful nation at that time in the world, Egypt. And so Joseph was blessed in many ways. He would get to save his family, as it were, by allowing them to have access to land and to grain. And Pharaoh brings them in, and because of the good man Joseph was, and Joseph's reputation is what got these other people blessed. And so had Joseph gone into Pharaoh and said, look, these are the people that sold me into slavery, they were mean to me, they were trying to kill me, all this kind of stuff, I would imagine Pharaoh would have just simply said, well, we'll take them all out. We'll kill the whole family. That's what this is the ruthless way the world lived. And believe me, it was that simple. It didn't, there were no proclamations, there was no big written decrees to be said. Pharaoh could have just said, take them out, and they'd have been gone. And somebody like Potiphar would have been the ones to go and do it. But all that being said, this was an incredible thing. Joseph could have done something far easier to some people's thinking and disobey God and those kinds of things. Real quickly, I want to point out the passage. I'm not going to read all the verses, but in Daniel 6 verses 1 to 24, we read the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And this is what's interesting about this scenario. Daniel was sort of set up, and let's just read a few of the verses so I'll give you a little bit of context. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. The king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, we'll not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. Let it be said of each one of us that our greatest weakness, flaw, and blind spot is how we serve God. Boy, wouldn't the world be a different place? Wouldn't everything be different if God's own people were so enthralled with serving Him that the world would say, you know what? Unless we can find something wrong with God, we're never going to find anything wrong with them. What a powerful statement. And of course, this is politics, like politics always is. We're still at this point going through a political process, and I shake my head and I am heartbroken, and I've expressed my dismay enough over this. But this is politics. Well, we don't like him. He's getting notoriety. We need to mess him up. We need to do something to smear mud on him. We need to start throwing mud and doing as much as we can to get him in trouble, or at least not favored as much. Why? Because they wanted to be in charge. One thing, folks, I want to tell you, and I'm going to get off my soapbox here in about 2 seconds, but I'm going to say this. You show me a politician that's trying to show you the self-righteous, and I'm not talking about real righteousness where people truly are correct and legal. I'm talking about the thing where they don't see their own flaw, but they want to mess somebody else up so that they look better. All that person wants to be is in charge. That's all. But I'm doing it for you. I'm standing up and fighting for you. Know what you're fighting for is your own political future. You're not fighting for me. Nobody's come and asked me what I think, and you certainly haven't. And so anyway, that's politics. And here's Mr. Daniel. He's standing up there and trying to do his job, apparently doing a good enough job that the one in charge looks at him and says, that's the guy I need to put in charge of all the other animals in this circus. He's the one who needs to be telling them what to do. So anyway, And we find that the king goes on, and I'll read on a little bit more. Let me get back to my place. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. Be careful of people complimenting you before they ask you what they want. But anyway, all the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the high officials, the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast in the lion's den. So what'd they just do? They couldn't cast an aspersion against God or Daniel's faith in God. So what they did, they were setting Daniel up. They were going to set him up for failure, because the one thing they knew is, of all the things you could tell Daniel to do, you could not tell him not to worship God. He was not going to go along with that. He was not going to do it. And that's exactly what he did. He worshiped his God and didn't stick to the mandate that was given. As a consequence, he is thrown in to this den of lions. They get him thrown in there, and let me read toward the end of this. I'm going to skip down a little bit, but I do encourage you to read verses 1 through 24 of Daniel 6. So they put Daniel in this den, and they put a big rock over the mouth. Verse 18, the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. He couldn't sleep. He loved Daniel. He didn't want to have to do this to Daniel. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a loud voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also towards you, O king. I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased, gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. What a way to deal with a litigious group of people who falsely accuse. First question, what right thing did Daniel have to stand up for? I have been asked, and others have been asked, what do we do if a higher authority says we can't worship God? Now in today's world, they say, well, what happens if they close our church doors or whatever? Well, we may close our doors. I don't know. I don't know that that's necessarily in the plan, though it's a possibility depending on how COVID goes. But what if somebody comes to us and says, well, you can't worship God? Well, what are you going to do? Well, I can tell you right now what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep worshiping God. That's not going to stop me, and I doubt it'll stop you. And that's what faithful people do. You can't tell people to worship God. I don't get my permission to worship God from the governor or from the president or from the mayor or from anybody else. It comes from God, and until they can outrank him, I'm listening to him. So that being the case, Daniel stood up for what was right. He stood up and did the right thing. But it must have been hard to do so, because he was in a position where it would have been easy, just go along for 30 days. Remember, this had a time limit. It was for 30 days, and Daniel said, I won't for one day go along with this. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to go home and do what I've always done. I'm going to open up my windows and I'm going to pray. And people are going to hear me pray. They might even see me pray. But I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do the same thing I've done. Folks, I want to tell you something. No matter what the world does, no matter how it changes, and it seems to be changing every day, minute by minute, keep your faith. Do what you've done that is faithful to God, and if anything, become more resolute in it. Become stronger in it. And I believe what you'll find in that process is that we'll be blessed in ways that we could not possibly have imagined. And ultimately, in the end, no matter what difficulty we may go through in the present, it will always be better to serve God than it will be to serve man, our pleasure, or momentary circumstance, whatever the case is. Always let God be God, and we'll always find our time having been well spent. I thank you this evening. I know we've gone longer than we normally do. We had a couple of longer passages there, but I encourage you to get these studies. There's a lot more information that you can study through the week. God bless you. Thank you for being with us, and I hope you have a wonderful week to come.